It's time for our first framework assigned. I really like these. The idea here is that we're going to talk for a moment, and we'll do this throughout the course, about how what we've been discussing is used inside popular and famous frameworks and libraries that are used on millions of sites around the internet and in many web applications. For our purposes, although framework and library can really mean two different things, we're going to essentially talk about them as if they were the same thing. For our purposes, a framework and a library are the same thing. A grouping of JavaScript code that performs a task and is intended to be reusable. But we're going to dive deep into how libraries like jQuery or frameworks like AngularJS use some of the concepts we're discussing in their code. So let's talk for a moment about default values. We can combine some of what we've learned about default values and also about execution context in the global environment to understand some lines of code that appear quite often in popular frameworks and libraries if you look under the hood and look at their source code. So, for example, I have this index.html file that's just referencing app.js. I'm going to pretend that I have a couple of libraries or frameworks that I'm including in my project. So let's say lib1 and lib2 are two libraries that I have. Now, I'm going to go ahead and create those. lib1, lib2. And in library 1, just for an example, I'm going to go ahead and set a variable. Let's say I want the name of the library. So the library name, this is lib1. And this, suppose, is written by one person, and lib2 is written by someone else entirely, but they also create the library name, lib2, the same variable. So what's going to happen? Well, when you look at the app.js file, and I console.log library name, we need to understand what's happening when these three JavaScript files are run. These three script tags are not creating new execution contexts. They're not separating the code in any way. Quite literally, they're just stacking the code on top of each other and then running all of this JavaScript as if it was inside a single file. And often, when in production JavaScript environments, you actually combine and minify your JavaScript code into one file anyway. So it's important that these files not collide with one another. Let's run this code for a second. And let's see what we get. I'm going to go ahead and open my console window and look. lib2. So what happened? Well, what happened was that when looking at how the JavaScript source files were loaded, library 1 or lib1 was loaded as line 1, lib2 was loaded, so that's line 2 of the code that was run, and then console.log. This was all then treated as global variables sitting inside the global execution context, and thus attached to the window object, in the case of the browser. So I declared var library name, and that was attached to the window object, and the second var just replaced it. Right over this first library name. So this can be a bit unusual when dealing with frameworks or libraries. Maybe we've accidentally collided with another library, or maybe another library is there to replace us. So we want to be nice about this. What can we do? Well, let's go to lib2, and we can check and see if library name is already in the global execution global variable. So I could say window.libraryname equals, and then I'll say window.libraryname or lib2. So what am I doing? I'm checking to see if there's already a library name in the global execution context sitting on the global variable, which is window. If it is, then I'm just not going to do anything. And if not, using the OR operator to set my default value, because if this wasn't set by anyone, it'll be undefined, then I'll set it to the value that I want. So if I run this code, it's lib1. See that? Because this first JavaScript file, that's the line that was run. This is put onto the window object. And then in my second library file, I just made sure that I wasn't colliding with it by checking to see if something was already there of that name. So in the case of a lot of frameworks and libraries, you'll see a line of code that looks something like this, where it's actually setting the object or the set of functions that define the library or the framework, and not bothering to do anything at all if something is already there of that name. Now, of course, this could in itself cause some errors, but that's likely the developer's fault for perhaps colliding with the name that's already in the library he or she is using. And it makes it easier to debug and understand what's going on, because the entire library just won't be there, because it will say, oh, you've already used that name, so I'm going to exclude myself from doing anything at all. So when you look inside the source code and you see something that looks kind of like this, understand that it's checking the global namespace or the global object to see if something of that name is there, so that it doesn't collide or override it.